everyone, and welcome to another episode of Tiff Talks Tech. Today, I'm excited because I am joined by Jack Miller, who is actually a repeat guest. I'm so excited because our conversations always open my eyes. But he is a data scientist and AI ethicist at HIO. And today, we're going to be talking about compliance and regulation watch for AI and multifamily. So I think this is an exciting topic. It's definitely relevant. Jack, before we dive in, for anyone who may not know your background, can you share a little bit about what you do and who you are?
Yeah, it's so good to be back.
Yes.
I'm Jack Miller. I currently work at HIO. We sort of build large language models and AI solutions for real estate, focusing on like staff models mostly. But yes, I've been there for about 3 years. Prior to that, I worked in neuroscience and on the kind of like AI innovation side of things and societal impact studies. Yeah. And so ever since I've been at HIO, day to day, I help kind of audit our AI models and ensure that we have them act as we want them to. They're guardrailed in accordance with, state and federal laws, and also just kind of bringing transparency to the big black box that is AI.
I love it. For people who think that regulation doesn't really apply to multifamily, what are they missing out on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such an interesting field because it so often is really like the first target for a lot of really broad scale legislation or especially kind of like federal action in this space because it is so high impact. Like these are where people
Yeah.
live, and there's so much legislation built into the industry around, fair housing, like the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Even like FTC and FCC are often likely to get involved in multifamily through marketing and advertising. So yeah, it's a big space where we've already seen legal action being taken. So yeah, I think it's hard to avoid.
Yeah, definitely. I remember, I think I might have shared this before, but I worked with an AI company when I was on the operations side. And I remember asking them if they had any fair housing regulations in place. This was a while back, so hopefully they do now. But I was like, do you have any fair housing regulations in place? And they're like, what's fair housing? I'm like, my God, we can't use this vendor.
Yeah, well, and I think part of it too is that AI is such a like a technically dense field
Yeah.
that especially for a while there were such a few people who really really knew how to like utilize it effectively, and so they were kind
Yeah.
of just hopping industry to industry, and multifamily looks like such a lucrative space. It's kind of like, the medical industry in that way where it's like an
Yeah.
easy place for the mind to jump. And so yeah, there are occasionally these really outsiders
Yeah.
coming in not knowing a lot.
Yes, totally. What's changed in the last year or two that makes AI compliance a real concern?
Yeah, I mean, I think the usage of AI has completely ballooned. Even just in the last year, there was some reporting done recently that showed, like 65% of landlords are using like a AI powered rental screening. Like 30% aren't even vetting that decision.
Mm,
So it's becoming like much, much more widespread. But then also there's this kind of like interesting interplay between the federal and state legislatures around how they want to deal with that. Where on the federal level, we have massive like rollback or what looks like rollback, like a third of HUD has been
yeah.
cut or we're down to a
Mm,
third. And then in response, there's these kinds of like emergent state legislatures that are creating a like patchwork of rules to follow or not follow. That makes now
mm,
an interesting time to be talking about this.
yeah, totally. Um, Especially when you look at multifamily, what makes this industry even more vulnerable when it comes to ethics and that compliance standpoint?
Yeah, impact is a big one. So the types of decisions that are being made in multifamily are so high
Mm,
impact by every definition. And so even things that seem really small can have like a really
yeah.
outsized impact level that then will be prosecuted quite intentionally.
What's an
Um,
example of that?
yeah, so like screening algorithm. So like if you have
Mm,
an automated screening algorithm, or let's just say like a leasing chatbot that says, okay, do you accept, Section 8 or like voucher based income? If your chatbot just says a blanket no to that, that might seem like a completely invisible interaction and often might be completely invisible unless you have someone like reading those logs. But then there's been some pretty prominent cases where class action lawsuits have gotten together saying that we were discriminated against for
Mm,
this response to a chatbot. And then I think that was a 2023 case on that.
mm.
And then, yeah, the like property management company is left paying that hefty fine for something that they might not even known have happened.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to my next question. Like, obviously, I think that kind of answers it. I was gonna say, can operators be liable for how their vendors are using AI? So that would be the case, right?
Yeah, it's sort of like a shared responsibility right now, and I
Mm.
think that's something that we'll see become clear in the next couple years as more and more of these cases sort of come up through various courts.
Yeah.
Right now, the kind of modus operandi of a lot of these tech companies is buried deep within their terms and conditions will be something saying, "We're not responsible for the answers that we provide, you should have, like, a human review." And even, like, OpenAI, these foundation models have clauses like that. Right now, that appears to be decently good of a defense strategy, or at least a, deferring of responsibility strategy.
Yeah.
But I do think that's gonna change in the next couple years.
I could see that for sure. So I want to talk about some of the risk areas in multifamily AI. And the first big one is really fair housing, like you mentioned before. Where does AI introduce that risk to leasing, screening, and marketing when it comes to fair housing?
Yeah. There's a couple of branches. We can start at just like the leasing chatbot level because I think that's maybe the most obvious and common. With that, it tends to be these sort of is someone getting a response that feels like a denial,
Mm,
or is there like a communications and marketing issue where, a chatbot might answer the question of what sort of people live in this community,
yeah.
or one of those like closeted sort of fair housing audit questions.
Yeah.
Um, and so unless you're auditing your chatbot like you would like a new leasing agent, you can find yourself in hot water there. But then kind of further up the renting chain and process, as more and more of these like screening decisions or even decisions around like whether a lead is like likely to rent, all of those are going to have inbuilt bias because they're based on likely, I mean, ideally your own data, but also potentially competitors' data of the types of people who live in those places. Bias will creep in there. And so there's kind of a more amorphous bias that can begin to happen across the org at each of those
Yeah, I could see that. Are there privacy risks as well when it comes to like AI call recording or chatbots, anything like that, and CRM integrations that teams might be overlooking?
Yeah, so state by state, there are laws around, like California has really strict laws about informed consent of recording
Mhm.
of calls.
Yeah.
If you are using, let's say, like a voice-based AI and then training that AI on those call recordings, you could get yourself in hot water there. But then also, I think just as like a business use case, depending on how your vendors are using your data, that also potentially invokes like a
Mm,
privacy risk around your own corporate policies or your own like trade secrets for how you do things. So having like a good conversation with vendor partners around how they silo your data, especially in the world of AI where that can become so murky and cross
mm.
contaminated, I think that's
How would
worthwhile.
you recommend an operator ask their vendor that? Like if someone feels like they're pretty beginner level in understanding, what would you recommend them asking?
I think asking just sort of how how do you approach like data privacy,
Yeah.
broad question, and that will at least give them the floor to show how they've been thinking about that. Because, there's going to be kind of two types of people, the people who are like optimizing for a SOC 2 compliance or like these very hard boundaries. And then there's people who are building that into their product design flow. And that will become
Yeah.
clear.
Yeah, that makes sense for sure. And so I want to talk about the regulatory landscape. What current regulations in the US should multifamily leaders at least be aware of and know that exists?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of obvious ones,
Yeah.
unless you're an AI innovator, not from the space. Or like Fair Housing Act. Yeah, like all of those are good ones to watch out for. It's such a tough time because of the like Trump administration's approach to a lot of this is about rolling back prior guidance. And so we're in a bit of a flux state with federal legislation
Mm,
where there were like massive cuts to HUD. And then in January, HUD proposed that they should actually roll back the disparate impact line saying that they're no longer going to like prioritize disparate impact claims. But disparate impact is still a crucial part of how they determine like Supreme Court precedent. And so it's not that those laws have disappeared, but they're kind of like on a different focus.
Mm,
And so what's actually happening is we're finding like more and more class action lawsuits and kind of like alternate ways in which these people are seeking out disparate impact claims. So like following the big Real Pages suit, they're still litigating all of these like private state-based lawsuits that are kind of
mm,
popping up all over the place. So
yeah.
yeah, in terms of the operator, that paints a very complicated picture, but I think it's basically just being aware that there are state legislatures that are now trying to counteract federal rollbacks. So that means in places like Utah, California, Colorado, New York, all of those are initiating sort of patchwork laws around things like algorithmic pricing, that sort of
Mm.
collusion, anti collusion metrics, as well as these like privacy things like the California call recording and other state based legislatures.
Yeah, and that kind of leads to my next question as well when it comes to, like, federal versus state. Are there any major differences when it comes to those laws and AI? I know you kind of mentioned a little bit, but is there any other, like, big things that stand out?
Yeah, I think the industry at large is kind of putting the pressure on vendors to be able to navigate that with
Yeah,
regards to AI policy specifically.
yeah,
It's sort of operating under the assumption that your AI partner will know how to navigate and subvert these various restrictions. So I think, yeah, in your kind of vetting process, making sure that they have a tacit awareness of that, and ideally that their operating principles are ethically minded enough to where they will still be compliant across state lines for these different things. Because a lot of these could be first steps in what would become an eventual federal legislation. Uh,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, that makes sense. Do you think that enforcement will increase, or do you think it's gonna kinda stick in that guidance and warning phase?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because one aspect of AI as well is that it's actually a lot easier to test sort of fair housing claims. So you could now actually have like a chatbot interact with leasing softwares to do fair housing audits. And then you could litigate those through like a private lawsuit or class action claim because there's no requirement that that you actually have like an intention to buy in order to be a defendant in a lot of these cases. So it's very interesting. Like, there's the potential for these types of suits or, fair housing claims to balloon as it becomes easier and easier to kind of spot these issues.
Yeah.
And like we just saw 2024 had the highest number of fair housing claims in 2 decades. So
Wow.
people are definitely like minded about that, but it's kind of remains to be seen with this administration because the data for 2025 hasn't come out yet. What that will entail, but I can see it really going either way.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, going over to kind of vendor accountability, as we kind of touched on this, but are there any other questions that you think operators should be asking their vendor partners when it comes to compliance? Like, definitely, what are your privacies around AI? Is there anything else that they should be looking at? Are you SOC 2 compliant? Anything like that?
Yeah, I think looking for a strategy around what happens if the model says something wrong or makes a decision that's wrong or that those kinds of like escalation pipelines are really
Hmm.
good. That
Yeah.
speaks to a sort of transparency and also I mean, I always say if they say it will never hallucinate, then like they're hallucinating. It's like so built into the structure.
Yeah.
So yeah, like I think an openness around who is accountable when it makes an error, how do we patch that error? And then also sort of a transparency and visibility into okay, when are times when we should be doing our own internal testing? Like when you have a model upgrade or when policies change, like having kind of a strategy and that you can build alongside that vendor partner for potential disruptions to business as usual with that. I think those
Yeah.
are kind of in the weeds questions to start asking.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any things that should start being written into those contracts that wasn't necessary maybe 2 years ago?
Yeah, yeah. I think the data privacy of your institution's data is a good one, like siloing and
Yeah.
to ensure that your data is not being, not training a foundation model that they're trying to use, really
Makes
understanding kind of like where your data exists in their flow. And then also ideally trying to ensure that you can have access to that same data for your own auditing purposes. More and more, I think the industry is trending towards observability in these AI
yeah.
systems. And so that kind of like allows your team members to ensure that you're not landing yourself in hot water if, say, that they misanswer that question about the types of people who live in this community. That's a
Yeah.
big one. I think also having some semblance of like an accountability agreement of really like questioning potentially if your vendor just says like the answers we give are your responsibility.
Yeah.
Like kind of there's really not like an easy way to litigate that, but at least having like an upfront conversation before the contract is signed
Yeah.
around what that flow looks like and kind of the steps they do to mitigate that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know like a lot of vendors, they worry about giving away too much of their secret sauce. But how transparent should they be when it comes to their models, logic, and the
Mm.
technology they're using?
Yeah, I mean, this is a problem across all industries. I think the one of the tough things about AI is because it is so technical and for a long time was sort of gate kept for so
Yeah.
long by, engineering teams, and in and of itself is not very explainable. And so the idea of having like um, a clear sort of publicizable model summary is really, really hard to do because you can't possibly plan for every use case. So
Yeah.
outside of the kind of industry space and a lot of academic spaces, they have like model cards. I think I talked about that last time I was here, where
Mhm.
they sort of like, okay, here's what the model was trained on, here's what it's designed to be used for. And that's sort of like one first step that people can take to start making their AI systems explainable. But I think, yeah, better than that is these sort of dedicated like escalation paths, this human in the loop steps. So, like, at what point are we having a human review this? Those are sort of engineering decisions that are not a problem to release as like IP and more so speak to like the decisions that have gone into making this system ethical.
That makes sense for sure. Okay, so I want to talk about like the biases that might show up. How do algorithmic biases show up in those housing decisions? I know you mentioned screening is a big one. Is there anything else that pops up often?
Yeah, well, with any AI system, there is a huge chance for these sorts of biases to appear. So, outside of the multifamily space, there's a huge, cohort of like classic examples where with like hiring algorithms that learn to disadvantage women who went to all women's colleges or traditionally like black names will get devalued by some of these algorithms if they're trained on like existing employees where that bias is being reflected. And so that can pop up everywhere with these sort of like screening algorithms. They're such good one or not good ones, but they are such clear ones to look at because they fall into this automated decision pipeline where there's a long history of,
Yeah.
these like black and brown people systematically being disadvantaged by these algorithms for, a number of like targeting and strategic model building reasons.
Yeah.
But outside of that, I think yeah, you just have to start looking at like anything that is making a yes no decision. I mean, if 60% of landlords are encountering those in their everyday life, you really have to look at like, okay, so what can I learn from the yes? What can I learn from the no that informed it? And then how can I start building like accountability metrics to make sure that those are, valid reasons for a no? And that no can be like screening, but it can be any number of like abstract concepts that pop up throughout the journey from like applicant to resident.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you think that AI can ever really be not biased? Or do you think that mitigation is more of the goal?
Yeah, mitigation is definitely the goal.
Yeah.
It's funny in the AI ethics academic space, even there is such a huge amount of literature around what even constitutes fairness because you can use a number of like competing mathematical equations for what is fair. It's like, do you want to minimize it so that there are no false positives? So like no one is getting a yes that shouldn't get a yes. Or do you want to minimize it so that there's no false negatives where no one should be denied if they were valid. Like the
Mm,
kind of getting the ratio between those two is always going to be, that will actually, to use a bad term, will have like disparate impact either way.
yeah.
And so this idea of the kind of platonic ideal of an AI model that is perfectly fair is even internally impossible if we could set the end goals. So
Yeah.
yeah, education is really the step. And I think more and more we're kind of realizing as a society that we need to be thinking very intentionally about AI usage and risk mitigation.
Yeah.
And so more and more vendor partners will be actively trying to combat that or building it into their process flows. But yeah, definitely a key consideration.
Yeah, for sure. Do you think that companies should start having internal AI usage policies for their on-site teams, or do you think that, like we kind of talked about, a lot of that's with the vendor?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually almost like a different line of thought that I also find really interesting, which is like the use of kind of like generalist AI models to support the daily leasing activities on site. And there's a couple different ways of thinking about that. Like a lot of research has gone into so-called shadow AI, which is basically where employees are using like Claude or GPT kind of without the administrative or like managerial approval. So they're just using like their own version of GPT or Claude to go about daily business things. And the usage of this shadow AI, which is such a dramatic term for it, has like skyrocketed. Now we're seeing like 60-70% of companies have like some sort of shadow AI within them.
Mm,
And so I think with that, there comes loads of risks of, hallucinations, potentially people downloading and uploading SOPs into like outside of your contained environments. And also just the general confidence that comes from these large language models, where it will very happily, 15% of the time make up an answer that then that person goes and treats as Bible.
yeah.
Yeah, I think having like internal ways of coping with the need, whether that be via providing a corporate solution or having other ways to kind of like tackle the problems that people are feeding into Claude and GPT is like a
Mm.
good business strategy going forward and definitely kind of like a newer way of approaching AI in the workplace.
Yeah, that makes sense for sure. When it comes to the consequences of AI, do you think it's more like they're going to get fined or big major lawsuits, reputational damage? Like what's the big thing we're facing?
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be like these big, high profile cases
Yeah.
that crop up like once every couple years. And you definitely don't want to be that person, but that won't happen to everyone. So I think it's about mitigating risk and ensuring that even these small cases can be really, really costly, especially if they're actually litigated, then there become, huge legal fees associated with that. So even if you're not facing the big reputational damage of people who shall remain unnamed but are known,
Yeah.
then there's still kind of like a monetary incentive to be ethical about this, especially as more and more of these cases are kind of circumventing the traditional HUD investigation and being brought up through kind of roundabout methods.
Yeah, for sure. Are there any other industries that have made mistakes like this that we can learn from?
Yeah, there's some funny little case studies with, I think this was in a Canadian court, but Air Canada, there was a guy who was talking to a chatbot and basically was promised like he could pay full fare and then get a full reimbursement on like a bereavement fare because
Mm,
to a funeral. And ultimately the Canadian court upheld that they had to stand by the actions of their chatbot because they actually didn't follow through on this fare that the chatbot completely made up. So there's yeah, as chatbots are kind of popping up everywhere, we're seeing a bit more of that sort of thing where
yeah.
the deferral of responsibility is becoming like a problem. And Air Canada was liable there rather than
That
any
just,
like
like, it unlocked a new fear of, like, what if the AI tries to give away free rent? Like, that could happen.
yeah, and same with like car dealerships had this as well
Yeah.
a couple years ago where it's so easy to jailbreak these AI chatbots
Mm.
that you really have to put in work to make sure that they won't just make up discounts. I don't know if you saw Claude's Vend. Did you hear about this?
No, I didn't.
Okay, this is funny. Though not another industry, it's parallel.
Yeah.
So Anthropic, who makes Claude,
Mhm.
their internal team had Claude run a vending machine as sort of like an agentic test.
Hmm.
So it was responsible for sourcing the supply chain and managing all of the like customer interactions through Slack. And it was basically just like a mini fridge in their office. And they tracked the profit margins of this little vending machine. Throughout the course of it, the Claude basically learned to start selling like tiny, tiny tungsten cubes because like there was a huge demand for it, and basically things that would never be in a vending machine started selling them at a huge loss. Like
Oh
there were
my god.
people were using like fake discount codes that were consistently working. So, and granted, these are like AI engineers, but it
Yeah.
became very clear that they can't handle the kind of multi-stakeholder decision making that's required to actually like, source a supply chain, stock it, interact with the consumer. Yeah, so this idea of like AI being the entire portfolio manager or this like huge process overhaul mechanism, I think is still to be tested.
Yeah.
And these kinds of like funny use cases are really good at finding the specific vulnerabilities across industries, really.
Yeah, for sure. What do you think? I'm trying to think of like, often we want to be compliant, but we also want to be ethical as well. What do you think is the difference between just hitting that compliance mark and actually taking the next step towards ethical?
Yeah, I mean, compliance is sort of like the iron fist,
Yeah.
and ethical minded is just like, running around in a field with rainbows, I think. And so it can be hard to advocate for running around in the field with rainbows to certain people without the fear of the iron fist of compliance. But I think there is like a business use case for having safe and responsible AI deployments because, and even not just from, fear of fair housing audits, but just from the standpoint of if you're actually really mindful about your AI target, the process it's replacing, then you can actually build like a lot better experience for your staff. I mean,
Mm.
turnover is such a huge problem in this industry that if you're making AI that's actually automating what people don't like about being a leasing agent, then you might be able to retain your leasing agents more. And you can apply that logic to a lot of the kind of amorphous blob that is AI ethics, where, having more transparent systems also benefits you because you now have a huge data set that you didn't have before that
Mm.
can look at, okay, how have various people traveled through like the lead sales funnel? And so kind of like using that in mindful ways is like a quite valuable business use case
Yeah.
aside from fear of fines.
Kind of closing things out. If we look forward 5 years from now, what do you think we'll look back on and say, can't believe we were doing AI that way?
Yeah, I think the AI without like any observability
Yeah.
is still a little baffling to me. There are some systems where, let's just say, like a chatbot, you can't actually see what people are asking. Like if you were to just hook up like Copilot, oftentimes there isn't like an admin studio where you can see what people are asking, correct those answers. That's obviously quite personal to me because that's what the sort of thing that we build for in Hio.
Yeah.
But I think, yeah, automated decision making is going to be the kind of the next frontier of conversations around AI. If we look at like upcoming legislation in, places like California or the EU, a lot of that kind of treats automated decision making pipelines very differently from more generative AI, large language model applications. So I think we'll definitely be thinking differently about those types of things and the requirements that should be built into any automated decision making. Yeah, and maybe just like the ways in which we are kind of experiencing the everything is AI phenomenon. There's a huge like business case to call yourself AI and to be like a really fast frontline adopter of AI. And I'm interested to see over the next 5 years if those types of conversations that are happening in, executive boardrooms, if that slows. Because what we're seeing a lot of the time is that these AI pilots for AI pilots' sake often are failing. Like 95% typically show like no tangible returns after the kind
Yeah.
of like honeymoon pilot phase. And so, yeah, just thinking
Yeah.
more about AI.
It's almost like an overusage of the word AI. And I know, like, two of the companies that I market for right now, they both have AI in them, but it's not our main point of selling because it's just overkill. A lot of people are nervous around it, and we've just heard it a lot. We're not afraid to say that we use it, but it's just not the main selling point that we take because it's just everyone wants to say that they have it just to say they have
Mhm. Yep. And that pressure a lot of the time I think comes from people who don't necessarily have like an amazing grip on what the day-to-day operations look like.
it.
And so it can be making like a purchasing decision for AI that's not necessarily the most helpful to their
Yeah,
staff.
definitely. Okay, so I have a bonus question as well for you. It does
Okay.
not have to be related to this topic at all, but is there a tech tool in your life that you are loving right now?
Yes, great question. I should have listened to my last one to see what I said there. We'll see how consistent I am. Yeah, I think I really gravitate towards, especially in the LLM sphere, these ones where you can get like clear citations and um, kind of more like research based answers.
Yeah, what's your go-to model? Like, is it ChatGPT, Claude?
Yeah, so in ChatGPT, the deep research I find is a lot better for that type of those types of questions than like base GPT. You can see like actual citations.
Mm,
Sometimes they're very misinterpreted, but at least you can make that value judgment yourself.
yeah.
Perplexity is a pretty good one as well. It's more like an enhanced Google search where it will there be very upfront with like specific links. Yeah, outside of that, I'm somewhat like, bearish on AI in general.
Yeah,
So, yeah, it's funny. I find myself going a lot to like, more like Web 1.0, Web 2.0 application. It's like a sort of granola movement.
yeah.
So, like, yeah, I don't know. Things like MapTap, the geography app, love that. Little online trivia leagues, that sort of thing.
That's fun. I love it. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I always learn so much when I talk with you. Is there anywhere that people can find you and connect with you?
Yeah, you can email me at jack@heyhio.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn, Jack Miller. It's a very unique name, so you might have to search bio with that. And yeah, feel free to hit me up and we can chat about AI ethics.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.